Serious. Paramedic, EMTs of Reddit. What was the creepiest case you've dealt with? Please like and subscribe to support this channel. Police officer here. If a paramedic goes on a creepy call, we usually show up too. Worst I ever saw was a suicide via slit wrists. This woman was clearly struggling mentally. She went into her basement and started sawing at her wrists horizontally with a rusty hacksaw. Bleeds a good amount, and then starts walking around the house. She wasn't dying quick enough, so she sat down in a chair in the middle of the living room, and started going at her wrists again, this time with a pair of scissors. I was the second person inside the house. It looked like a massacre. We searched the house top to bottom, fully expecting to find multiple dead bodies in there. I've never seen so much blood in my life. Every single room had a trail of blood in it. The woman was found on a chair in the living room. Rigor mortis had contorted her body into a really strange, unnatural pose, and her face was haunting. Literally the stuff of nightmares. Her wrists had huge chunks of skin, veins, muscle missing from them. Saying she slit her wrists is inaccurate. She ripped them to pieces. Probably not too scary, but even looking back on it now, this gives me the willies. I was a student at the time, third manning with my team leader and a medic. We got called to an overdose. Went flying over there on blues. We arrive at the house and find a man and a woman in frosty silence. On questioning, it turns out the dude called the ambulance because she said she would overdose during an argument. Things get a little heated and we ask the guy to leave for a few minutes while we chat to the lady. There was a whole unfortunate backstory to this lady which was irrelevant for this story, but suffice to say she was a nice woman with some problems who was just trying to do right by her kids. We double-checked with her when we had some privacy that there hadn't been any violence, and she said there hadn't that day or before. The creepy part was when the dude came back in. I was kinda redundant here. My team leader was talking to them about the situation. The medic was making notes about the meds this lady has. I wasn't doing anything productive, it didn't need the three of us. I was watching that fucking guy. There were small things that just put me on edge. He was saying he'd keep hold of her meds so she wouldn't OD. It didn't seem like it was simply caring. He made a big deal of, well, we've had all this fuss now and these fine people could be out saving lives, when he was the one that called the ambulance. His entire demeanor seemed to be trying to convey affection and caring. At one point he tried to put his arm around her. She didn't react. He moved in closer, she still didn't react. He moved closer still. She's outright ignoring him now. He kinda squeezed her. Only a little. In another situation it might have been fine, but it just seemed so out of place. He did a little grr noise while he did it. Straight afterwards he looked me right in the eyes, then moved away and lit a cigarette. I consider myself well adjusted. So far, I've been able to deal with the creepy hallucinations of the mentally ill, the gore, the dealing with death. Something about that moment of eye contact shook me to my core. There was never enough to act on, not enough to report to social services or the police or anything like that, but I still think about her every now and again. I hope she's okay. U.S. Army medic with EMT certification here. One call that will always haunt me was on an unresponsive female at around 03:00 in the morning. We get there and do some pointless CPR along with the fire department. Of course, it's pointless, she had been dead for a while, no shockable rhythm and clear rigor mortis. But the most disturbing part, the original caller was her 11-year-old daughter, who had just spent 3 days with her mother's corpse and called because she was lonely. Also didn't help that the victim was completely naked when we arrived. Depends on what you consider creepy, I guess. A majority of the cases that some people would consider creepy would be ones with schizophrenic patients laughing and talking to people who aren't there. Watching someone experience full-blown visual and auditory hallucinations can be pretty creepy. 1. We did have one call where we picked up a patient who claimed they were being tracked by the US government. Of course, nursing staff and everyone involved assume that it's just some kind of delusion run-of-the-mill psych patient case. He spent time talking about documents that he previously had access to, and how the government didn't want him to release the information to anyone. He yelled and screamed as we put him on the cot about being sane and that we were being brainwashed. As we loaded our patient into the rig, he says we'll be followed to the next facility. Jokingly, my partner asks what was going to follow us, which he replied with a black Lincoln Town car. As we leave almost immediately, there was a black town car behind us, which stayed behind us for the roughly 15-minute transport and only disappeared as we got within a few blocks of the new facility. Dropped the patient off and all he had was a smug "I told you so" look on his face. 2. Another call we had, which I would consider the creepiest patient experience I had ever had, involved a pediatric patient who refused to lay on the stretcher on their back and instead wanted the back of the cot up and to lay face down. Stared me in the face while I was sitting in the jump seat the entire time with a very ominous smile, back at probably a 70-degree angle. Transport time was almost an hour and a half. Throwaway account. Was an EMT in NY for a small-town volunteer ambulance corps for a few years and then an EMT in MA at college for a few years. I would say I rarely saw anything that was creepy. Calls that are upsetting are not usually the ones you might think of: bloody, fatal, near fatal. 1. Responded to a call at college on Halloween night shift. Someone had found or seen this college-aged girl passed out in a bush. She was probably the drunkest I'd ever seen a semi-conscious person. Couldn't answer questions at all. Couldn't keep her head, upper body up at all. Kept vomiting on herself. But what upset me the most was that this girl had probably been out with her friends and somewhere along the way they just left her. I just couldn't wrap my head around the scenario where someone's friends would think that this was an okay condition to leave her in, at night, shit-faced drunk, in a place where she's lucky someone even saw her. 2. Responded to a call that probably came in as male acting strangely or mental distress or unknown or something. Got there and there's a middle-aged, maybe slightly older, couple and the man is having a stroke or TIA. He needs to go to the hospital, but he's fighting us. I had to restrain him, and this was no easy task. I was in late high school at the time and this was an adult. While someone else put him on oxygen or tried to get him on the stretcher or something. As we're dealing with him, and everything's taking longer because we can't get him to cooperate and he's throwing off his O2 mask and fighting us, physically, the whole way. We learn that, while he's not capable of answering our questions and is speaking to us frantically in another language, can't remember what it was. It turns out that he actually does speak English, he's even a doctor. It was terrifying to see that someone who, in their right mind, would know the danger of his situation, cooperate completely, and speak to us in English was incapable of doing any of those three things because of his condition. Since this post got some action, I'll add a little more. 3. Another call that upset me a lot was a typical drunk guy walking funny on the street call. We get there and the kid is really not all that drunk. He's disoriented, but he's with his sober girlfriend and they both just want to go home, which I would have been totally fine with. This never should have been called in the first place, though I don't at all begrudge the caller. We'd rather show up unnecessarily than not show up when we're needed. But the local ambulance, not affiliated with the college, had also been paged, and when we transferred care these guys wouldn't take a refusal. The thing is, the kid and his girlfriend were clearly international students and English wasn't his first language, so, drunk, his verbal communication wasn't fantastic. But I could just tell that if he'd been an American and his English just a little bit better, that they would have never taken him to the hospital. Instead, this poor kid is terrified because a cop is making him get into an ambulance for no reason. Sometimes the upsetting calls are upsetting because of what we do, not the patients. I have had a lady with open sores all over full of maggots. A guy on PCP jump out of the story apartment building holding a 2-year-old. A woman pour herself in gas and burn to death. A guy get decapitated in a Jeep wreck going the wrong way on the interstate. A crapload of shooting deaths. A 9-person shooting. A guy throw and kill a 1-year-old might be the creepiest. We didn't know what happened when we showed up. We started doing CPR and the 1-year-old had an identical twin sitting in the room watching us. That was pretty messed up. I saw a guy jump out of a 9-story window. He didn't bounce. Burned up people and dead kids are probably my least favorite. Thought I had told this before but didn't see it in my post history, so here it is. Had a call around 9 o'clock just after I came on duty of an elderly male with possible high fever. Not a whole lot of info as the caller was his elderly wife who according to the dispatcher was hard to understand. Anyway, we head out, get there 7 minutes or so later. As we go in, the wife is sitting at the kitchen table just inside the door, so we ask her what's going on. She answers that he has been complaining he is too hot all morning. We go into the next room, which is dark due to curtains covering the windows, but there is enough light to see a dead man sitting in a chair. Now mind you, he was not recently dead. I'm talking blackened face, rat bites around the mouth, wasn't complaining this morning type of dead. I set down my equipment and my partner goes to turn on the light next to his chair so we can verify the obvious. As she goes to reach for the light, the dead man groans and reaches for her hand. After collectively shitting our pants, we jump into action. Come to find out he was on oxygen and a smoker. He was complaining about being hot because he was literally burning up. What looked like signs of death on his face was scorch marks and melted plastic. And to answer the obvious question, I don't know. He was still alive when we got him to the hospital, and I never asked what happened to him after that. Paramedic here. Probably the most creeped out I've been is on a death call. I know there's no chance of it happening, but I always envision scenes from zombie movies or shows when I'm on the scene. Like this scene from the Dawn of the Dead remake. Just the way bodies look when they've just passed away, it's eerie. I always get the heebie-jeebies on those calls. I'm more likely to be outside waiting on the coroner instead of inside protecting the scene. Okay colleagues, no offense, but you guys need to turn the creep factor up a notch. The first time I ever had someone dancing naked and bloody on the top of a police car during a psychotic breakdown was an eye-opening experience to a rookie. That guy got his blood all over me and ruined my new jacket. He kept staring at me maniacally, constantly repeating random numbers and saying, "I am Satan," over and over again. It's kind of weird how quickly that sort of run or call becomes routine. I had another psych patient early in my career that sticks with me for gross out factor. She was an Asian lady in her 60s but swore that she was a 15-year-old girl. She would keep saying the most morbid and grotesque things over and over. I don't remember exact details, but she did talk about being raped repeatedly and having her skull caved in that morning. Then she started going on about how, "I've been bleeding out of my vagina every single day for the last 3 years." I asked her if she was currently bleeding because vaginal hemorrhage is a legitimate medical complaint, and who knows, she very well could have been raped. At that point she removed a bloody maxi pad and threw at me, smacking me square in the chest. My partner erupted in laughter and said, "Dude, that is the most disgusting thing I have ever seen." On a Halloween about 4 years ago, I was working a shift with a good buddy of mine and we got a run for an unknown medical. We were a couple of cocky mid-20-somethings. On the way up the elevator we got caught up in an argument over A's versus Giants Bay Area baseball. We almost blew off the security guard when he was opening the door to some random apartment. "Oh, she's definitely dead," the guard said, and we were instantly like, "What?" Usually the cops get to this sort of thing before us. Plus we had no idea a dead body was involved. Yet there she was, reclined in a lazy boy with her feet up all the way in a position of comfort. Her eyes were rolled back and mouth agape just like in the movies. Over her head was a translucent plastic bag taped neatly around her neck. I don't know if it was the combination of reclined death in a lazy boy, a nonchalant plastic bag, a possible murder, or the fact that it was Halloween. But that was a creepy scene. I think we actually had a shooting and a stabbing on that shift as well. In general, the creepiest calls for me are hangings. Something about a body just hanging listlessly in the dark. The last one I had we were dispatched to without lights and sirens, which itself was weird. We ended up at a Safeway with a bunch of cops who had no idea where the hanging was. Apparently, the guy who called it in was casually shopping in the produce section. This guy mentions to us the body was at the construction site across the street. Needless to say, we told the guy to show us where now. Sure enough, there was a well-executed hanging about 5 feet of the ground. Good rope rigged over a facade and tied to cement blocks on the other side of a chain-link fence. Seeing a dead body hanging in the dead of night is one of those things that stays with you. You keep it in your back pocket so you can tell the story later when someone asks about the job. I have a few other stories I wanted to share, but this turned into a giant wall of text faster than I expected. Thanks to anyone so reads this. In some weird way it's kind of nostalgic to think about old times and shifts. Got a call around 2 a.m. for an unknown medical, which is always a kind of, oh, thing for us. As soon as we pulled up, all the cop had to say was, "Well, I don't even know." Walked up to a lady unconscious in front of her house that had her face cut similar to the Joker and her throat slit. She was in her pajamas, no bag, no ID, no belongings at all outside. Her door was locked and there was a dog barking inside, all the lights were off. No one knew what the hell happened and no one seemed to know any information about this lady. No name, no age, nothing. She was alive when we got to the hospital. I hope she's alright today, but I often wonder who did that to her and why. Another notable call was what was called in as an attempted suicide a few years back. A literal bloodbath. According to the husband, his wife locked herself in the bathroom with a knife and tried to kill herself. He said he was unable to open the door to help or stop her. Got there, door was unlocked, lady had her throat cut open and both wrists were severely cut. I do not believe for 1 second that this woman did this to herself. Not for a second. I don't believe anything ever came of it, and I have no clue what happened to the woman. Last thing isn't really creepy or scary, but I think it's pretty cool and worth sharing anyway. We had a CPR job for a man in his 50s. Got a pulse back on the way to the hospital, but usually we don't hear anything about the patient after that. I attended a funeral, for someone unrelated to this patient, about a year ago and saw the guy that was dead on my ambulance just hanging out standing next to me. It was a definite WTF moment, but it was really cool to see him alive. Got a call for a hemorrhage in the early morning one shift last summer. When we arrived we found a woman in her early 70s who had bled out within the time of out arrival. According to the husband and son-in-law on scene, they stated that she was picking at her dialysis port in her clavicle region. They said she pulled it out, but were very interested in how quickly they were going to do something with the body, and neither were fazed whatsoever. It was the most maroon blood just pooled around her and they didn't bat an eye. Asked some other uncomfortable questions and we then turned the scene over to the sheriff's office. We were all a bit skeptical that one of them pulled it out, seeing as she stayed under their care 24/7 if she wasn't in a dialysis APPT. Who knows? Old story, but still gets me after a long time. The call was for an older woman, lying in bed. When we get there, the smell is horrendous of a dead body. There are millions of flies everywhere, and yes, there is a living little old lady and lying in the bed, and about 5 feet away, there is a body covered up by a sheet. The longer story is the lady was a dementia patient, and the husband was the primary caregiver, and based on the number of flies and state of decomposition, the police estimated the guy had been dead for about 3 weeks. The woman must have been getting some food out of the refrigerator, but it was totally empty at this time. The creepy part, on the way to the hospital with the woman, she said, "I hope that nice man on the floor is okay." The incident became known as the one with Maggot Man. Not a EMT, paramedic, but I am a firefighter and therefore a first responder. This is the story of how I responded to a call involving the Antichrist. I was just getting off of work when a call goes out across dispatch saying that there was a possible overdose and that we needed to respond. We get to the scene and note nothing out of the ordinary, until we enter the home. After asking where the patient is, we're escorted to a back room with a man exiting and rebuttoning his pants. We enter the room to a sheriff's deputy detaining a petite, naked woman who has attempted to jump out a window and has shit herself. She had flung both blood and shit everywhere. She tells her mother, the owner of the home that's been very helpful, that she has a parasite inside her and that she doesn't blame her mother for letting her father rape both of them. The paramedics then enter the scene and attempt to administer sedatives via IV to calm this woman who has claimed the only drugs she is on are Prozac and a little weed. The most memorable moment came next. In the moment that the deputy released her hand to the paramedics to administer the IV, the patient slides her entire hand into her rectum. She then begins to spasm violently and tell us if we don't stop being racist she will smite us because she is the Antichrist, the harbinger of the end times. It all ended when I was given a second pair of handcuffs to bind her ankles. I was in the metaphorical blast zone of the Antichrist's ass, and therefore terrified for my life. All went well thankfully and I was spared the brown death. I was then called back to let the paramedics handle her. To this day I've never dealt with anyone quite like the Antichrist. TLDR. The Antichrist shit herself and called me racist while resisting sedation. I've posted this elsewhere so I will copy it from there. This is the most gore I have seen from a call and made me think a little about the irony of it. I responded to a call where a janitor was dusting, cleaning a quite large stone cross in the middle of the church. He had been up on a ladder dusting, cleaning, when he slipped off the ladder and proceeded to try to hang on to the cross to keep from falling. Unfortunately, the weight of the around 200 pounds man was too much to support. The cross fell towards him, landing on his left arm, with a part of the horizontal stone of the cross pushing his muscles and tendons out of his wrist like a squeezed toothpaste tube. Then the cross fell completely on him, splattering his brain across the floor. Quite disturbing, and definitely the most horrific and gore-filled call I had ever witnessed. IDK if this counts as creepy or not, but it's a good one. This was also one of my rookie calls. Probably like the fourth or fifth one I ever had. We got a call for a male in his early 30s with heavy groin trauma. Exact words of the dispatcher. We roll up lights and sirens and the guy is waiting for us on the front step with a towel over his crotch. We barely come to a stop and the guy is already running towards the rig holding this towel. I asked him what was wrong and he moved the towel and this guy's dick was just barely hanging on. Apparently he had lady problems, so he decided to fornicate with the food mixer he had in his kitchen and accidentally turned it on. So we get him in the rig and it was bleeding everywhere and I had to stop it, so I do the best I could, and tried not to cause any more damage, because it was so bad I thought if we hit a bump too hard, this guy's dick was gonna come off. I'll never forget my partner was dying laughing in the front of the rig the entire way to the hospital. Kinda heard a chuckle, so I look in the mirror and tears are just streaming down the guy's face, he can barely hold it and he was laughing so hard. He tried his best to remain professional, but it didn't really work.